Hello, good morning. My name is Strate. I'm from Fordham University, and our session is Poe, Melville, and Media Ecology Approaches to Literary Studies. By way of introduction, first let me know, where's Matt? See there, Matt, some years ago I remember him complaining to me that we don't do enough 19th century stuff in MEA, and why not? So partly this is to shut him up. But the point actually is well taken. We tend to think of media ecology generally as kind of coalescing in the 20th century, and then we leap back to Plato's Phaedrus, and depending on your inclinations, to the Ten Commandments before that. So we do tend to leapfrog, but of course we see, references to Thoreau, to Emerson, first talking about extensions, technology as extensions. And when we look at certainly the work of folks like McLuhan and Ong, we do see references to Poe, to Melville, right? Melville's there, and even Arthur Conan Doyle comes up certainly for McLuhan. And I hope this opens up, and I think actually it would be a very interesting kind of study to just do overall the media ecology, the roots of media ecology in the 19th century, both in fiction and nonfiction. But as a kind of step towards that, this session brings together, it was originally planned to bring together 4 presenters. Unfortunately, Sarah Vandenberg, the first presenter, is not here. Unfortunately, she is arriving later today, so that means she won't be presenting on this panel. The good news is that she will be presenting her paper, which is Victim or Villain the Dwarf from Poe to Freaks, will be presented later today at 1:45 in the Representations and Media Representations section. That's session number 2013 in your programs. So please make a note of that. Make a note, I said. Barry, are you listening?
I am listening. I'm actually going to...
Okay, very good. So, the good news is that gives us more time for our 3 speakers. And with that in mind, we'll get started. And we're going to go otherwise in order as it's in the program. So our first presenter is Callie Gallo from Fordham University, who's working on her PhD in English. And the title of her paper is Detecting the outré, Poe's Dupin, and Media Ecology.
Whole thing's in French.
Just as we like. For the Canadians.
For the Canadian audience.
So, Callie.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you, Lance, once more for putting this together. It was so generous of you to do. So I'll just get going. So as Lance said, my paper is entitled Detecting the Outré, Poe's Dupin, and Media Ecology. So because we have a little extra time, I guess I was just trying to think about kind of the origins of the image or representation of a media ecologist in the 19th century. And Poe is such a recurrent touchstone, especially with Dupin and others, so I kind of wanted to look into the kind of historical origins of that figure and the kind of biases and maelstroms that are involved in formulating that. So the works of Edgar Allan Poe have been a recurrent touchstone in the field of media ecology. Marshall McLuhan, Walter Ong, Camille Paglia have all addressed his short fiction and poetry in relation to literate and print culture, as well as the emergence of electronic media. Am reads the detective story, a genre spearheaded by Poe, as a culmination of the psychodynamic effects of the printed word as distinct from oral communication. Through its heightened attention to unique detail, structure, and individual consciousness, as well as an emphasis on independent reading and observation, the detective novel for Am illustrates a shift to abstract categorization, formally logical reasoning processes, and an articulated self-analysis that arises from text-form thought. While Am locates Poe at the center of the communication practices extending from literacy, McLuhan sees the author's stories about Siavas Dupin as anticipating a collective experience engendered by electric technology. In Understanding Media, he argues that the introduction of the telegraph moved Poe to develop a genre of writing that anticipated and acknowledged reader perception like never before. For McLuhan, the detective story requires do-it-yourself participation on the part of the reader, establishing his or her role as co-author. This role in turn spurs human interest by expanding our point of view beyond that of ourselves. In line with McLuhan, scholars like Richard Copley and Matthew Pearl have argued that Poe writes his detective stories with readers in mind, instructing them about the power of close reading and leading them to recognize the formal characteristics of communication that often go unnoticed. Dupin is established as a singular character through his integral awareness of media, from newspapers to street noise to facial expressions. And he appears to embody the media ecologist par excellence in McLuhan's formulation, in which individuals, namely artists, are awakened from media narcosis through a technique of suspended judgment of their media environment. But the more we look at Dupin as a representative figure of a media ecologist, the more we see that his pursuit of the truth through media awareness and perception is anything but an inclusive model for the average citizen in the midst of the rise of mass media. This presentation considers the detective stories of Dupin, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Mystery of Marie Rachet, and The Purloined Letter, published between 1841 and 1844, to examine the ways in which the author situates his protagonist within a changing world of mass literacy and print media that Poe himself occupies. An environment where the individual practice of reading became a communal or mass event like never before through the proliferation of printed advertisements and newspapers. Through the detective novel, Poe demonstrates how his poet investigator Dupin is, as Am stipulates, immersed in and a product of a literate communication environment of printed words and images. But Dupin also stands outside of this maelstrom, theorizing and understanding media through his sidelong perspective that inevitably leads to his success. And even as Poe's narrator appears to illuminate the detective's methods of perception for the reader, Dupin's remarkable ability to see what others overlook in media, like newspapers, architecture, clothing, and gestures, becomes more miraculous and even obscure with each case. Poe mystifies and idealizes media awareness through Dupin, giving a rarefied air to his technique. Seeing through the biases and content of one's media environment thus becomes excessively other in and of itself in the Dupin tales. It's a heroic ideal attainable only for those who possess the exclusive means to read virtually anything and anyone in a city filled with text. In this manner, I find that Poe's detective fiction shows how a writer steeped in the newly emerging visual mass culture of print ventures to reach an integral awareness of his communication environment, while also shaping the image of the artist as a media ecologist to amplify his social relevance as distinct from the common citizen. During the 1830s and 40s, the United States experienced its highest period of literacy ever recorded. Cheaper printing methods made text and images more accessible to the masses than ever before, and as such, standardization, objectivity, notions of social legibility developed in relation to their influx into American cities and European cities. The construction of public identity aligns with the concept of the confidence man in this period, a term that first comes into common usage in the 1840s, which infers that social acceptance depends on one's visible performance of self, or as Louis Latham describes it, a synthetic mediated self. Now part of a burgeoning consumer society, one's public persona could be likened to a billboard or advertisement, especially as the country lurched towards civil war and suspicions of collusion were on the rise. One's visible authenticity as a citizen, or one's social legibility, was put at a new premium for this reading public, inferring that both reading and seeing were primary means of identity formation, as well as maintaining social and national cohesion. In all three detective stories, Dupin's identity and talents are closely tied to his immersion in just this environment of print and literacy. As the narrator relates the exploits of Dupin, whom he meets in a library in Paris, we learn that he is astonished at the vast extent of Dupin's reading. The detective is often acquainted with the details of a crime through the newspaper, and he's asked to recover a letter stolen from the Queen in the final installment of the series. All of Dupin's analyses of physical and textual cues rely on a particular quality of observation in which texts, appearances, and patterns of behavior are cataloged and compared. This process of data aggregation and analysis is, as Elizabeth Eisenstein has noted, an elemental practice associated with the rise of print. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, the narrator describes how Dupin bests his opponents in a card game by cataloging their glances, hand movements, facial expressions, and casual or inadvertent words to anticipate their next move. While looking over the newspapers covering the untimely death of Marie Rachet, Dupin overturns various journalists' theories about the details of the case by identifying their biases for sensationalism and reevaluating the timeline of the murder to exclude their assumptions. For example, most journalists claim that the assault occurred under cover of darkness to avoid suspicion, but Dupin rejects this theory because of his unique analysis of time, place, and local custom. He notes that Marie disappeared on a Sunday morning when most people would be preparing for church and no one would really see anything during the light of day. As Zong rightly concludes, Dupin has internalized the attributes of literacy by conducting all of his reasoning independently and abstractly in his own mind. But his success also depends on expanding his point of view, using sidelong or peripheral vision to account for the circumstances and contingencies that others don't. In contrast, the prefect of police is critiqued throughout the series for his rote methods of investigation and reliance on tools like microscopes that narrow his perspective and hinder his ability to see the clues before him because his gaze is too fixed and too direct. Dupin's sidelong glance shows us there's something more to his method, which Dupin calls ratiocination. In the Murders of the Rue Morgue, where Dupin solves the confounding murders of Madame L'Espagne and her daughter, he tells the narrator that the police have fallen into the gross but common error of confounding the unusual with the abstruse. And as such, the protocols for investigation lead them nowhere. Dupin deviates from the ordinary or protocol in search of what is true, enabling him to read between the lines of strangely conflicting witness testimony in the newspaper to identify the culprit as, wait for it, an orangutan. Within the story, Dupin successfully analyzes reported testimony, assesses physical structures and spaces like a window, and evaluates physical evidence in ways that no one, including his well-read, wealthy companion, our narrator, can. In the Purloined Letter, he bests his nemesis, the minister, by identifying with his character and joking that he would hide a letter in plain sight instead of the nooks and crannies where the police have been searching. But just how does Poe's detective do it? Dupin's uncanny ability to recognize his environment as when comprised of forms of communication that often escape notice is only matched by his talent for understanding the patterns they convey, and these talents are attributed to his truly imaginative mind, the mind of a poet. The narrator explains that Dupin has a bipart soul made up of the creative and resolvent, and this combination fosters his peculiar analytical ability. Lydia Liu is quick to point out that Dupin's method, often aligned with gameplay, is by no means stochastic or purely random, but weighted towards a preference for the imaginary order. As with the game of even and odd described in the Purloined Letter, Dupin defeats his opponent by identifying with them on a psychological level, just as he does the minister, who, being a mathematician and a poet, is Dupin's closest double and most formidable opponent. Dupin is differentiated from his milieu by his creativity, which alerts him to what is peculiar, odd, or excessively outré, within circumstances considered mundane, simple, or obvious. While the prefect of police deems the poet is only one removed from the fool, Dupin shows that it's the poet who can see the truth when intellects of vaster capacity cannot, because they do not deviate from their usual methods when met with new circumstances. Only Dupin is able to see the letter hidden in plain sight, or identify a foreign-sounding voice instead of an animal rather than a human, because as a poet, he can vary his methods of perception to see not only foreground, but also background, something akin to noting the white space beyond the letters on a page. In every story, we find that it is not Dupin's physical senses that are wholly extraordinary, but rather his ability to synthesize the ordinary and the unexpected as media that communicate in excess of any assumptions of what they should or normally convey through an intuitive poetic apparatus. Both McLuhan and Lewis Mumford have argued that artists are most apt to understand their media environment, as they are more cognizant and perceptive of the effects of media forms and not simply content. But just as Poe's stories seem to reveal Dupin's specialized techniques of media awareness to a wider audience, his talents become more inaccessible and singular. In the beginning of the second story, The Mystery of Marie Rachet, the narrator remarks that Dupin's notoriety from solving this first case made him a household name. But at the end of the story, the reader never finds out just how Dupin finds Marie's killer,
We're merely assured by proxy that the detective in fact succeeds. In the final installment, The Purloined Letter, the detective dons green spectacles that seem to help him scour the minister's apartment without alerting him to his plans, adding a characteristic layer of mystery and obscurity. These inaccessible aspects of Dupin's process construe him as an idealized figure set apart from the common man, becoming even more removed from the average reader when he manipulates media for his own personal benefit in The Purloined Letter. In this story, Dupin creates a forged facsimile of the Queen's letter that he recovers from the minister's apartment to let the thief know exactly who has bested him. While planting the letter, Dupin has a man fire a gunshot in the street among a crowd of women and children who emit fearful screams that distract the minister. Here, the detective's creativity as a poet merges with his knowledge of street noise as a medium, and he distorts the relationship between reality and fiction by manipulating sound to fool his opponent. More attentive to crucial clues than the police, more intuitive than journalists, and craftier than a mathematician, the artist for Poe not only has the ability to understand media, but to independently shape his or her environment through media, an idealistic role indeed. This inflated image of the artist is likely Poe's reaction to his own vulnerable position as a writer during the rise of mass media in America and Europe. Poe was attentive to how printing and commercialism affected the formation of identity, not merely for citizens, but also for authors whose works were increasingly pirated without penalty, compromising their authenticity, originality, and income. He was an outspoken advocate of copyright law and rejected the rampant commodification of literature, even though he wrote for popular audiences. But it wasn't just literature that appeared to be cheapened through mass mediation. Speaking of American democracy in the 1840s, Alexis de Tocqueville hypothesized that the individual was a void, or a very puny object that only existed as far as he or she was mediated within political and print culture. His view emphasizes the vacuous existential situation it could create when individuals begin to be viewed as one of many reproducible texts, especially for writers struggling with the nation-state of authorship as a profession in this period. It also helps us understand why envisioning a poet as holding an exalted or sometimes powerful social and political position would be so appealing for a writer like Poe. Seeing what lies in plain sight is the challenge laid before media ecologists. Media are referred to as invisible environments because as listeners, viewers, or readers, we more often notice the content of media rather than its form or technologies. However, in post-detective fiction, learning about Dupin's method doesn't reverse the public's blindness to media. Indeed, our fascination with Dupin actually depends on widespread media narcosis. If everyone could perceive the world the way Dupin does, there wouldn't be much mystery. So, as such, Dupin's feats of analytical skill simultaneously point to the improbability of any average person acquiring them. As a reminder of this fact, the narrator who studies Dupin closely in each story is no more adept at solving mysteries at the end of the series than he is at the beginning. This persistent aloofness, even of a moneyed aristocrat, may have even appealed to Poe's audiences, because in certain ways, Dupin assures readers that the common person's mediated identity is likely to remain undetected for any given peculiarity, like the signs on the street that the narrator fails to notice in The Purloined Letter, which are hidden by dint of being excessively obvious. Dupin's skills also manifest as exclusive to the world at large because no one seems to benefit from solving these mysteries more than he does. He reaps large financial rewards, he bests his enemies, and he's able to kind of prove his prominence over the prefect of police, which gives him great pleasure and joy. So in the Dupin stories, a media ecologist only extends his point of view beyond his own experience to benefit himself. Created within and through mediated communication, Dupin is an iconic figure that represents the particular relation of an artist to the politics of identity, derived from the conditions of print culture and rising literacy. In the context of a nation increasingly bombarded with text, Dupin can be seen as a response to the rise of mass media in both its deterministic and creative extremes, where so much can be read, but the biases and patterns of mediation often go unnoticed. Reading and manipulating media effectively thus provides power and freedom for a writer at a time when, according to Danny Forston, American life becomes a showcase for images under the auspices of the graphic revolution. Dupin exhibits what Forston calls a new kind of eminence, only possible in an age of graphic reproduction. He embodies, however idealistically, the manner in which Poe and his readers may have wanted to see themselves as both wholly in control of their mediated identities and perceptive of that of others at a time when national insecurity and consumerism was growing. But by the same token, Dupin's effete sensibilities depend on the stymied media awareness of the masses. In The Mechanical Bride, McLuhan defines Dupin as a paradoxical figure for the middle class, because his feats of detection rely on their perpetual conformity and predictability, not their ingenuity as budding media ecologists. McLuhan argues that Dupin is at once a type of disinterested aristocratic superiority and of middle-class failure to create new social values. I want to push that idea further to note that Poe's stories rely on a consistent premise of female victimization, as well as gender stereotypes and ethnic prejudices, as we see in Murders in the Rue Morgue, when neighbors associate a non-human voice with a foreigner. In this light, we can see how the image of the media ecologist has been weighted historically with specific class, racial, and gender blind spots that still affect perceptions of the study of media ecology today. So while I agree with McLuhan that Poe does take his reader into account when he makes his detective stories or writes them, I've argued that he does not elicit a more inclusive understanding of their mediated world. Through Poe's detective fiction, we see that the figure of the media ecologist embodied by Dupin is excessively other. And as such, the artist takes his position as both privileged and peculiar, even as his talents become more widely publicized. It appears that in Poe's design, the artist's integral awareness of media should remain hidden by dint of being excessively obvious.
Thank you, Ken. Next is Thomas Zlatic of St. Louis College of Pharmacy, and really had to work hard to get him to actually come here today, because he seems to be running from one conference to another, so we're very pleased that he's able to squeeze us into his busy schedule. Tom is was a student of Walter Arndt's, and the title of his paper is Arndt's Broken Knowledge, Digitization, Hermeneutics, and Aphorisms, assuming he hasn't changed it again.
Well, I appreciate that comment about 19th century American literature being important, but also to point out that some work has been done on there. I do have a couple articles, one dealing with Melville and media ecology, his work on Clarel, which is the longest poem, I believe, in the English language, and about 5 people in the world have read it. And another on Melville's battle pieces, his poems of the Civil War, in which Melville, I believe, is the first poet to make extensive use of the telegraph. Even Ong claimed that this was Hopkins who did that in the Wreck of the Deutschland. And there's another work on the confidence man, the media ecology, that actually Ong gave his imprimatur to her. So some things are being done, and I think it'd be good to focus on that. In terms of this conference, I was anxious to come. But there is a Melville conference in Japan next week, and I had proposed there's Melville and traveling in media ecology. I thought was appropriate. And so I was going to talk about Melville, and then I said, I don't have time, and he said, you do have time, and I said, I don't have time. And by the way, I was the last one on his list that he called, which made it a little bit late to get started.
I just went alphabetically.
So what I've done is gone back to a conference, a paper that we gave last year at Gonzaga University on Ong, and it's taking material that Sarah Vandenberg and I are using for an edited edition of Long's unpublished manuscript, Language as Hermeneutic. Okay. And not having the verbal facility that Lance has, and being a literate person, Lance sometimes says, I think, that I actually come from an oral world, but no, literate. I will kind of read a paper, but I know it's difficult, and so I tried to give an outline of where we're going with this.
Sorry, I haven't used a PC.
I think blank twice.
I like it so far.
Blank twice.
Maybe blank once.
It's just blank. It does what it says it does.
This is what the woman told me.
There you go.
Yeah. If you'd like, just signal to me and I'll switch the sides.
There's only, this is just the outline, and then there's a few longer quotes that I thought to create some cognitive dissonance by having you read while I speak. So there's not a lot there, but this is the outline of where we're going. Starting with, now, so the topic is the aphorism. And the aphorism, starting out as a genre, what constitutes the genre? Because it's one of the oldest, well, I shouldn't say one of the oldest, but it goes back deep into human history, the genre does, and yet it's one about which people have the least agreement. I mean, I'm using superlatives that I can't justify, but. So what is the genre? And broadly defined, it's a pithy prose statement expressing a pointed observation of universal truth. But that doesn't distinguish it greatly from the apothegm, the maxim, the wise saying, the proverb, the adage. And so we could, and it has been associated, the aphorism has been associated with the proverbial wise sayings of an oral culture, whose stock and trade were proverbial phrases. But it also would fit the wisdom literature books of the Talmud and the Christian Gospels and many other religious traditions. It would fit the first treatise to use the word aphorism was a medical textbook by Hippocrates. And it was throughout Renaissance humanism and Renaissance science. It extends into contemporary times, particularly with hermeneutic philosophers. And it's been used by such disparate figures as Hippocrates and Jesus, Francis Bacon and Pascal, Rochefoucauld, Goethe, Kafka, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein. All were aphorists. And that makes it difficult to relate the aphorism to media ecologies. It's been all over the place in many different places. Although some of you probably recognize that, interestingly enough, has been said that Nietzsche's turn to the aphoristic tradition was a result of his increasing blindness. And he became unable to write. He got himself a typewriter, and the typewriter moved the sensorium around for him, and he started producing short, pithy phrases. However, I think there's some wisdom to the statement by Joel Westerdale that says the aphorism may be an anti-genre. This is a quote. Repeatedly transgressing the bounds that seek to define it as a genre, the aphorism irritates the comfortable sense of closure that a clearly defined genre provides by revealing and magnifying the constructed nature of genre itself. And I think this is kind of the idea that motivated the interest of both McLuhan and Ong in the aphorism. So now we're down to McLuhan and Ong. So, as Renaissance scholars, literature scholars, rooted in an Aristotelian logic, Ong and McLuhan were intrigued by this verbal art form that straddles the borders between literature and philosophy. And it substitutes for argument and demonstration such literary rhetorical devices as the metaphor, metonymy, hyperbole, oxymoron, paradox, polyptoton, a syntheton, anticlasis, juxtaposition, and wit. Now, Ong and McLuhan are noted for remarkably contrasting styles. Ong, of course, being best known for terse, oracular pronouncements that infuriated and mystified his audience. And Ong is kind of associated with detailed, heavily documented, discursive passages. Nonetheless, for both men, aphorisms played an important role in their thought and thinking, but with different emphases, resonances, and tones. There's the overlapping. I think McLuhan uses aphorisms more heuristically as epistemological probes, whereas Ong found in aphorisms openings to metaphysical depths that elude more methodical, systematic, and digital explorations. The aphorism as broken knowledge is an appropriate vehicle for Ong's oral hermeneutics that privileges dialogue over digitization and is open to the unspoken and unspeakable that resonate in and under both thinking and conversation. So I would guess most people are familiar with Elena Lambert's Marshall McLuhan's Mosaic. where she has argued that McLuhan's oracular style was an attempt to create a new form of post-secondary orality in a field or mosaic approach. That is, she says, a verbal, vocal, visual form of writing that is not linear, but acoustic and tactile and participatory. So his prose had a discontinuous structure that engaged readers as co-producers, merging the secondary orality of a new electronic media with orality of pristine forms of knowledge based on a language now mediated through a literate form. And so, in his 44 Cambridge dissertation on Thomas Nash within the context of the history of the trivium, McLuhan explored the importance of aphorisms for metaphysics and science in the tradition of Bacon, whose aphoristic style, McLuhan said, was a way of, quote, keeping knowledge in a state of emergent evolution. So in his dissertation, I think this may be a quote here. That's no. It is. Yes, it is. So, writing in aphorisms, many excellent virtues. It trieth the writer, and except they should be ridiculous, they cannot be made but of the pith and heart of sciences. Discourse of illustration is cut off, the examples are cut off, the connection is cut off, and that therefore it represents a knowledge broken, which invites men to inquire further. Whereas methods carrying the show of a total do secure men as if they were at the farthest. So again, broken knowledge for McLuhan means you have to reconstruct and have an emergent evolution on the part of the reader. So that if we go back into the outline. So broken knowledge. The purpose of the aphorism for thinkers such as Bacon, Burton, Donne, Brown, and apparently McLuhan, quote, was to portray not a thought, but a mind thinking, or in Pascal's words, the peinture de la pensée. The aphorism is knowledge broken, stripped from argument and proof, which creates cognitive dissonance and stimulates knowledge as a process rather than a content. So not surprisingly then, in his reminiscences of McLuhan as a former teacher, oftentimes was a little bit dismissive of what the ideas that McLuhan had on him. But he did say his most effective pedagogical trait was the use of aphoristic statements to upset paradigms and to get people thinking. And Baum's colleague, Maurice McNamee, had the same point. He got us thinking, he got us thinking. Alm, too, professed distrust of method and systematic thinking. And, interestingly for me, in a 1968 never-delivered conference paper called Aphorisms Regarding the Media and the Census, I think he was getting a little jealous of McLuhan, perhaps. He toyed with a series of loosely connected aphoristic paragraphs on the sensory base for concepts, one of which discussed McLuhan in terms of prophecy and apocalypse. And these are in the Alm archives. And though, as we shall see, he did anchor his writing on a few recurring aphoristic statements in his 450-plus books and articles, characteristically, he had a more conventional style. Of course, keeping alert to the resonances proceeding from the silences that lay under and beyond discourse. So, no, I think we're still there.
Okay.
But we're going to aphorisms and metaphysics. Nevertheless, in 1974, in a remarkable letter to Randolph Flum, and Randy is putting together this afternoon an attempt at an Alm Society, and he had done a dissertation on Alm in the 70s, so there was a lot of communication between the two. And Alm therefore identified the focus of his intellectual pursuits, explaining that communication, personalism, and metaphysical statement were convertible in his thinking. Personalism, metaphysical statement, and communication were convertible. And in another letter of self-scrutiny, he suggested, wondering aloud, I don't think that's it.
Rhetoric, romance, and technology.
Can you back up one?
I'm sorry?
Can you back up?
Back one? Yeah. That's the baby quote.
Oh, okay. No, we're not there then. Sorry. I went to Kinko's this morning. I thought this would be helpful, but apparently it's not. He said this: I am not quite sure that the evolution of the media is at the center of my thinking. As a matter of fact, I don't believe it is. What is the center? Metaphysics, I suppose. And I'm not sure that metaphysics somehow ultimately, I am sure that metaphysics somehow ultimately rests on aphoristic statements. Written about the same time as this letter, Ong's book on noobiology, Fighting for Life, says, the truly profound and meaningful principles and conclusions concerning matters of deep philosophical or cultural import are invariably aphoristic or gnomic and paradoxical. You can see how the aphorism fits in there. Aphorisms usually are built on paradox of some sort. Their meaning is both clear and mysterious and dialectically structured. One might profess that experience is the best teacher and still maintain experience is the worst teacher. Quote, the opposition between the two statements is not symmetrical, is not, but asymmetrical is but. When you look carefully at the one statement, the somewhat askew qualification buried within it shows, revealing that the statement is really duplex. And when stated in duplex form, at least one of the two resulting contrasting elements will have new duplicities in it. The is-but structure of asymmetrical opposition is an alternative to the flat contradiction of is-not of binary thinking. Experience is an excellent learning tool, but you cannot also die from it. It's better for me to see you get run over by a car in the street than have to do it myself. Similarly, the medium of the message may be true, but not complete or final. The medium is not the message, is also true, in some ways, that must be negotiated in dialogue, of which there is no end. So in his own massive doctoral dissertation, Ramus' Method of Decay of Dialogue, I think at that time was the longest dissertation at Harvard, Ong documented how the printing press influenced a reconceptualization of knowledge in terms of vision and space, as exemplified by the 16th century education reformer Peter Ramus. To illustrate this point, Ong also contrasted aphoristic thought and communication with method of Ramus, just as McLuhan had done, who stripped the personalist cast from rhetoric and dialectic and oriented humans in a world of silent space. Now and this I think is pretty well known, but what I'm trying to point out now is that how much of this distinction he relates to aphorisms, which I didn't pick up myself earlier. A major motivation for his antipathy to Ramus' method was Ramus' rejection of aphoristic thinking, his denial of the duplex nature of understanding, and of his rejection of mystery and dialogue. Quote, to Ramus' mind, the sense that utterances can somehow touch mysterious depths which analysis can never quite fathom, without itself opening still greater depths, is of course lost. So, one of the most significant points of difference, now that's my emphasis, between Ramus and other people is his failure to provide any collection of sententia, aphoristic statements. Later on, he did not give the student a fund of expression or thoughts as matter for conversation or writing. And that's kind of important because Ong considered scholarship to be a form of conversation. Arrested dialogue. For Ramus, it's not useless unless it's first been analyzed discursively. And this passion militates against his resort to aphorisms and other pointed sayings. And then he's unrelenting. If an apothegm or proverb or an aphorism should any chance come to mind before one uses it and had to write it down and analyze it grammatically, rhetorically, logically, mathematically, or physically, what it contains is not comes out of analysis, not what it actually says before it's analyzed. To this mind, the sense that utterances can somehow touch mysterious depths which analysis can never quite fathom is, of course, lost. And this is not idiosyncratic. He said this also applies to Milton. And in a letter to his parents, he said, you know, I'm writing this book. What do you think I should call it? I'm thinking about calling it the clenched fist of method. Ramus in the modern mind. Clench. He says clench, thinking his parents might not know, is an old form of clenched. And I'll have to explain the title sometime, he says, but it's like the open hand and the closed fist, open hand of rhetoric, the closed fist of logic. Ramus had the clenched fist. The aphorism is open. And it's the closed fist of method that creates the decay of dialogue. And that it continues and accelerates the fractioning process begun at least by the time of ancient Greek philosophers who broke knowledge into pieces for easier manipulation. Now you see we're moving into breaking knowledge in two different senses. Aphorisms are thus part of an oral hermeneutic, a strategy to supplement the apprehensions of visualist, tactile understandings of the world with the resonances of approaches modeled on sound rather than texts. Ong's own aphorism, all text is pretext, calls attention to the necessity of dialogue to fill in the inevitable gaps and incompleteness of any statement, written, oral, or electronic. So if you go back to the outline. So, aphorisms and hermeneutics. When in the 80s he began his research into language as hermeneutic, Ong created a series of note cards, including, under the heading, Hermeneutics, the definition of aphorism as a truth which contains its own reflection on itself and hence incorporates within itself a dialectic which renders it bottomless as well as intellectually appealing. And on the same set of note cards, he recorded these notes from John Dominic Grossen's influential book, In Fragments, The Aphorisms of Jesus. He said, and quoted, "The aphorism, as opposed to the treatise, essay, or the more systematic forms of discourse, has the reader being challenged to hermeneutics. The aphorism is always a heuristic matrix and hermeneutical challenge. The heart of the heuristic provocation is the contradiction. The aphorism is antithetical. It defies all system. It's a form of epistemological conflict." And you see then this idea that Ong has about knowledge as being a part of a struggle. Not a struggle in a negative way, but in a struggle of dialogue with an external force, or with the self that's made possible by print. Bacon favored the aphorism over method because aphorisms, quote, leave the wit of men more free to turn and toss, whereas method is more suitable for proof and belief. Aphorisms point to broken knowledge, toward action. But for Ong, the major attraction of the aphorism was its link to hermeneutics, which people like Richard Gray would say aphorisms were truly important in the development of German Romantic and post-Romantic philosophy, including Heidegger and Nietzsche and some other people. The hermeneutical circle, this is Richard Gray says, the aphorism instances Heidegger's hermeneutical circle as, quote, the part that calls for contextualization in a whole. The aphorism challenges the reader to project a contextual whole under which the parts can be easily assumed. So the aphorism is a model of the hermeneutical circle. And it also talks about the contextualization of knowledge, which all implies by the oral hermeneutics. I do remember that. Okay, then, digitization. Now, knowledge, as we described it, broken into aphorisms, is dialectical. Though it's isolated from demonstration, argument, proof, and insight, it's still open to dialogue. On the other hand, knowledge that is contextualized from human interaction and isolated from knowledge can also be considered broken or atomized into data through developments in communications technology. Ong proposes that digitization, the ever-increasing dissection and mathematization of knowledge, is a result of all writing technology, not just on the quantification of scholastic logic and the condition diagrams of Ramus, that even in the first attempts at writing through clay tokens, as described by Denise Schmandt-Besserand. In his unpublished manuscript, which he said was a synthesis of his life work, he said there's two theses. Overall, I think this is the last one, language is hermeneutic from the very beginning. Language is interpretation. And the subsidiary thesis is that each application of a new technology moves language towards greater and greater digitization, the reduction of everything to numerically distinct units, creating greater and greater need for complementary, integrative interpretation or hermeneutic, which is counterfractioning. So what he's suggesting, there's two forces in contemporary times, digitization and hermeneutics, and they're in dialectical form, and the increasing digitization increases the need for hermeneutics. So in his own writings, Ong had a series of aphorisms such as these. Total explicit statement, human statement is impossible. In class, he would say that and wait a few minutes, or seconds even. And someone would always raise your hand and say, Father Ong, what do you mean by that? And he'd say, okay. Total human statement is always impossible. There's no end to conversation. And everything's related to everything else. There's no one way to say anything about anyone. And all text is pretext. And then let me go to the last one, hermeneutic. Truth, he says, in hermeneutics forever can never be simply propositional as the Ramus and Cartesian drive. It has to be limited in explicitness and demands interpretation. Every statement is embedded in history, nonverbal history, even more than verbal history. Okay. And that's what the aphorism gets is the unspoken and the silent behind every statement. If there is no completely explicit statement, there's always more behind the statement. The context supplies at least half of the meaning. The context is not in the text. The text only deals with what's on the page. The oral hermeneutic includes the entire process as much as possible. So that the oral hermeneutic is a supplemental to traditional visualist models by Dilthey, Schleiermacher, Derrida, and even Gadamer and Ricoeur. And so to wind up, well, I want to bring in Rosenstock. So this oral hermeneutic is related to the social philosopher, I can't say Eugene, Rosenstock-Huessing, who Ong had a great admiration for, and he wrote in his 1960 review of Rosenstock-Huessing, Professor of Philosophical Sociology. He says this: one returns here from the world of observation and a measurement to another world of gnomic expression and phonic wisdom. Rosenstock's conclusions, quote, tend to be of the nature of apothegms, not apothegms uttered in a vacuum, but brought to bear on particular developments in culture and thought. If this is proverbial wisdom, it is highly informed and sophisticated, one much more so than other such wisdoms in the past, because it's generated out of and brought to bear on a mass of particular details inaccessible to earlier ages. And you notice what he's saying is, I think he's going back to Lambert's idea of a post-secondary orality that is oral in approach, but based upon the digitization that print and electronics will produce. Okay, and this is not the same as Proverbs. Proverbs are a different oral, they come from the oral world. So he's not saying this is regressive, let's go back to the oral world. He quotes Crossan, Proverbs give no reason, for none is needed. Aphorisms does not, because none is possible. So, last statement. We can try and see if it's okay. No. In Language Hermeneutics, he says this. In his 7th letter, Plato says that truth, such as the philosopher desires, is not something that can be put into words like other branches of learning. Only after long partnership in a common life devoted to this very thing does truth flash upon the soul like a flame kindled by a leaping spark. And once it is born there, it nourishes itself thereafter. End of quote from now on. Plato puts this in his own way, but many persons in academia and many others today generally have enough existential continuity with Plato's own world to be able to understand him here without any particular further explanation. Although far from perfectly thanks to massive scholarship, they can reconstruct the fuller historical context, which is a social interpersonal context not limited to words, in which Plato was writing. And this type of truth is wordless. It does with silence. And I think the point I'm trying to make is, with the ongoing buzz of electronic culture, there is more silence than ever to be interpreted, if you can hear it.
Thank you, Tom. And last but not least, Matthew Thomas, who recently completed his PhD in American Studies, I believe, at the University of Iowa. The title of his talk is Melville as Media Ecologist, Moby-Dick as Media Ecology.
Hi, thanks, Lon. I'm going to try to be quick so that we can have some time for questions. Yeah, you just pull up that first slide. That'd be fine. I'm actually going to, though, read off my computer. Because when I printed out my notes, the hotel business center kind of screwed it up. But I hate people who read off screen, so I'm going to be one of those people. Just sort of by way of introduction, Lance's comment initially about me giving him a hard time about wanting to bring in more of the 19th century is kind of the background for which this presentation comes out of. Specifically, I'm sort of thinking of this. Do I have to go?
It's not on this one.
No, it's not on.
Specifically, this presentation sort of comes out of me kind of thinking about merging media ecology and American studies concurrent kind of with my time as an American Studies PhD student, which is happening now over, as Lance mentioned, and trying to kind of fold the two together. So it kind of works in concert actually with previous talks that I've given at the MEA. I'm thinking particularly one I did in St. Louis, I forget the year that was, in 2010. I did one in 2010 in St. Louis on American Studies and Media Ecology, and then I did one at the University of Maine, I don't know what year that was, on specifically transcendentalist thinkers as kind of proto kind of media ecologists. So if anybody remembers those, not that you need to, that's sort of the background of this. And so specifically this is sort of about the novel Moby-Dick, or specifically kind of about Herman Melville specifically. And so this is the title that was in the program, but if you go to the next slide, I have sort of two intro slides. I think it works sort of better like this. If you think of the novel, and if the novel is a kind of work of media ecology, then perhaps the novelist might be thought of as a kind of media ecologist. And so we already have mentions of some of his other thinking in Melville, in the work of Ong and McLuhan, and some other stuff. So I wanted just to give first a little bit of background, like on the book itself, because it's sort of kind of interesting. And then I have kind of 3 points I want to make about it in terms of thinking, 3 ways you might think of the novel as a kind of work of media ecology, and then I kind of have a conclusion. So Mike, I'll just sort of cue you whenever. Maybe go to the first one. Okay, so here is a copy of the latest, most recent Penguin edition, which has nice woodcuts and a really nice intro. The book is from 1851. It's sort of one of the candidates for the great American novel. Some call it the great unread American novel. There's a lot of sort of humor and jokes about people not being able to get through it. The kind of the central conceit of Woody Allen's sort of fake documentary Zlatic is that the character goes into a kind of state of personality kind of psychosis because he hasn't read the novel Moby-Dick in the 20s and is therefore unable to kind of communicate with the intelligentsia of the day. The really interesting kind of thing about Moby-Dick is now that we think about it as being like this great book, but when it was published in 1851, it was a total and colossal like failure, and it sort of, Melville was sort of a recluse then on the publishing scene for the rest of his life, even though he did really some interesting work, including like the poetry, and the Confidence Man, and some other interesting stuff. it was only 60 years or so after that it begins to be recuperated and it begins to receive like this tremendous amount of attention, which is still the case today. So from like, I would say the 1920s on, it's just gotten tons and tons. And so I'm not able to recount like the whole history of critical reception, the Moby-Dick, like, but it's huge and massive and like kind of insane. And people who sort of work on it are kind of like as insane as Ahab's character in the book. I won't summarize the book for you other than to say that, you know, the sort of the basic kind of through line of the book is really actually pretty straightforward. It's Ishmael, the narrator kind of character, goes to sea, makes a friendship with Quike, goes on the boat, the Pequod, discovers that Ahab is this captain obsessed with this white whale named Moby-Dick that injured him in the past, and then it becomes this sort of adventure story in which they go and they get the whale, and then ultimately the whale destroys the ship and everybody dies except Ishmael. I told someone this, and they were like, spoiler alert, and I was like, oh, the book is from 1851. I was like, the statute of limitations has ended on this. So that's sort of like just the sort of the plot line, right? But the plot does not the book make, because the book is really interesting because of its kind of digressions on all sorts of other things, the history of whales in particular. So that's kind of leading me into my first point. We could go to maybe the next slide. Here's the title page from the original first edition. We could go to the next one. So my first point is about oil. You could go to the next one too. And we'll just leave this image up as I can talk over this. So the book in 1851 is coming at a really interesting time in American culture or world culture more generally. It's a time of tremendous kind of technological flux or technological transition. It's sort of right before a lot of technologies that we now think of as kind of instituting kind of the modern world have really got popular: photography, the telegraph, the railroad, all these other kind of things. It's right before the gold rush or it's sort of, the book's kind of concurrent with the gold rush of 1849, and it's sort of right before oil becomes a big deal in the late 1850s. And so the kind of interesting thing about the book is the whole kind of plot of the book, the whole kind of reason of the book, or the MacGuffin of the kind of the book, is this industry of whaling, which is kind of like insane to actually reflect and think back on, which is we used to go in ships and go and kill whales with harpoons to get the oil from their bodies so that we could light our lamps and have light. And so that's kind of like the whole kind of background of the book. And that sounds like so weird today. So like I was doing all this research on like the history of whaling that like I don't have time to get into here. But suffice it to say, like it's really kind of interesting when you think about it in light of McLuhan's comments on the light bulb as a medium. And so it doesn't produce content, but it produces an environment in which people can stay up at night and write and talk and converse. And so this is before the light bulb, this is the lamp. And so we're heating the lamps with whale oil until about 1859, which is when we start using kerosene. So the whole history kind of like of whale oil is really kind of interesting. Also, they're using it in soap, they're using it in makeup, they're using it in sort of pre-industrial machinery, they're using it in cosmetics, they're using it in crayons, they're using it in all kinds of things. So this, though, believe it or not, was like a huge industry in New England of the time and made tons and tons of people rich. So I just say oil rather than whale oil to suggest an analogy to today and like the oil of today and how that's like sort of a huge industry of today. We could go one more, I think. The next one is thinking about this idea of the sea as a kind of medium. You could go one more too. We'll leave it up like this. And here I'm drawing on a recent book by John Durham Peters, who some people may know of his work, who's a professor at the University of Iowa. And this is a new book that he has. It's coming out this month. I don't think it's already out yet, but I'm drawing on this. And his whole first chapter, his whole first full chapter, is really, really fascinating. And I really encourage people to actually get this book. It's on the sea as medium. And as the original kind of medium. And this is like the entire first chapter. It's like, I don't know, 70 pages. just on the sea. And so, he begins, I have all these kind of interesting quotes that I don't have time to go through, but, a philosophy of media needs a philosophy of nature, Peters says, and he talks specifically about the sea, like in great depth, and he talks, for instance, that in the 19th century, when one spoke of media, one typically meant natural elements, the sea, fire, air, water, not what we think of as like when we think of media today, like newspapers or television. So Moby-Dick provides us a chance to come back to this kind of like original definition, or this kind of older definition of media as being more kind of elemental, which is the subtitle of Peters' book. And so he talks a lot about like, the sea is kind of the medium for life on the planet and all this kind of stuff. And he also talks really interestingly and engaging about the ship, which is also sort of central to the book Moby-Dick. Of course, there's McLuhan's famous kind of aphorism, I guess, that the fish don't know that they're swimming in water, which David Foster Wallace, among other people, have talked about, that that we need to render these kind of invisible contexts visible, because fish don't know what they're swimming in. And so Peters actually has like a really interesting kind of discussion of that, and then he has a really interesting discussion of the ship as media, on the sea as media, and then from the ship we actually get like all kinds of interesting things. And Peters in this book provides like a really kind of like provocative list. So from the sea and from boats and shipping and whaling, we get things like navigation, steering, leverage, reading the sky and the stars, mapping, timekeeping, documentation, carpentry, waterproofing, provisioning and preservation, containerization, division of labor, 24-hour surveillance, defense, fire control, ballast, alarm calls. We get political hierarchy. We get nutrition. Think about the statement British are limeys because they need to get citrus fruit to prevent scurvy. We get navigation, gives us calendars, clocks, which comes into nautical almanacs and all kinds of things. So tools, the tide, lifelines, knots, tackles, pulleys, commands, all of this comes out of nautical or seafaring kind of culture. And the rain gear, weatherproofing, Peters' list here is like really, really quite extensive. And then where the edge of the water meets the land, we get all kinds of interesting things too. Piracy, border control, customs houses, taxation, smuggling. From seafaring, we also get the invention of paper machines for inventories and population, the trial, the manifest, management, cargo, identity papers, all sorts of kind of like interesting things. Wireless telegraphy, ship-to-shore communication, flags, fires, beacons, foghorns, bells, sight lines, lighthouses, signals. All of this stuff, of course, comes out of the sea and shipping. So this is all sort of there in Moby-Dick itself. Of course, the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell originally wanted people to say ahoy on the phone, where Thomas Edison won out with hello. And so, of course, also the sea. Peters has a really interesting discussion of cybernetics and the history of sort of naval work and cybernetics. And of course, sea metaphors are still really common to us. We talk about surfing the web or navigating the internet. I don't know if it's navigate, but we use these sort of metaphors to think about this. So, thinking about the sea as a medium, and then the ship kind of like as a kind of figure in the ground of the sea. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to be quick. And then my last point is just, I'm not going to be able to get to all the examples here either, but is just to suggest that Moby-Dick has kind of entirely suffused our culture. And so it's kind of part of our media ecology in kind of a broad kind of way, in that it's been the source of numerous films, numerous adaptations, comic books, Futurama plots, conversations in TV shows, film, music, poetry, all kinds of things. So it's stopped kind of being a novel, but it's kind of it's taken on this kind of wider circulation. So it exists in a third sense in this way. So go to the next one. So I have a couple examples here. The Wikipedia entry actually for adaptations of this is kind of good. I know it's like people are like, don't ever use Wikipedia, but I'm like, I don't care. It has like a really nice. This is like if you go to this page, it's a really nice, really long list. Keep going. please. Thank you. This is from the notebooks of Jean-Michel Basquiat, who copied out the table of contents of Moby-Dick and kind of just put it like this and rendered it an art project. A lot of other artists have used Moby-Dick for inspiration. Jackson Pollock has a painting called Moby-Dick. Frank Stella spent 12 years and did 138 paintings, sculptural works, and became kind of like obsessed with the book and did a whole series. So it's kind of had this like larger circulation. Keep going, next one. It made it to the internet. So there's kind of like this project of the entire novel done in emoji. Emoji-Dick. Keep going, next one. And then there's like some really interesting actually like Twitter accounts in terms of how Moby-Dick has made kind of the jump to online space. So there's this Moby-Dick at Sea, which just tweets using some sort of algorithm lines from the book, but just the juxtaposition with other people's kind of Twitter feeds makes for kind of interesting clash and interesting poetry. Keep going to the next one. As well as this account Moby-Dick at Sea, which tweets a picture of a page from each page of the book. So when people have done art and tweets this. So sort of thoroughly suffused in the culture. Keep going. And then, of course, one of the most famous examples is it actually works sort of forward. If Moby-Dick's kind of the present, people imagine Moby-Dick to be so resonant that it can be thousands of years in the future. And so Wrath of Khan, by my fellow University of Iowa alum, Nicholas Meyer, who wrote and directed the film, sort of is a reworking in some ways of Moby-Dick, and Khan is here quoting Captain Ahab specifically at the end of this. So keep going to the next one. There's just a couple slides. Yeah. Here quoted. So this is not verbatim from the book, but it's close enough, right? So he's going to chase him, and so leave it on this one. So this is the reason Khan's character is said to have been able to quote Moby-Dick is that this was one of the books that he had when he was imprisoned on whatever planet, some Star Trek people could maybe jump in there. And what's really interesting is that like I realized that like I actually have the same edition as Khan has. One of my editions. I sort of buy a lot of these editions. So this is the 1961 Signet paperback edition that me and Khan have. So just to quickly recap. Thinking about oil as a kind of technology in light of the technology of the time and the transition or kind of flux or the liminal state of kind of the 1850s from whaling oil in an older kind of craft economy to a more kind of contemporized oil-based industrial economy. Thinking about sort of the elemental nature of media with the sea and with the ship and all that then grows out of that. And then finally thinking about kind of like how Moby-Dick has suffused culture. And so my argument, given sort of like all of these sort of three things, and one could go into like tons and tons of detail on those and bring in the book and do all sorts of stuff, is to kind of think about or to try to recuperate Melville in some sense as a kind of proto-media ecologist or a kind of 19th century media ecologist, and to try to expand the boundaries of what we think of as media ecology so that there isn't what Lance said, those kind of gaps, like where it's just like Plato and then McLuhan, right? Like, so that we have a kind of through line and that we can say Poe and we can say Melville and we can say William James and we can say, I don't know, Charles Sanders Peirce and we can say all these other people and kind of, and I don't know, like I think that sort of it behooves the field to kind of maybe kind of think about that for kind of tactical and theoretical reasons. So this is just kind of as quick as I could do it, but that's it. Thanks guys for your attention.